Imagine a building that looks like a medieval fortress, but was built to save your soul. Its towers rise 40 feet above the streets of Philadelphia. Its walls are 3 feet of solid stone. From the outside, it looks like something designed to inspire fear. And it was. But step through the iron gate, and the architecture changes entirely. Vaulted ceilings, long cathedral corridors, a single shaft of light falling from above into each cell, like a finger of God pointing down at the man inside. This was Eastern State Penitentiary, and in 1829, the people who built it believed they had invented something revolutionary, not a prison, a machine for redemption. The idea was simple, and it was sincere. Place a man in total silence, alone with his conscience and his God, and he will become penitent. He will reform. He will emerge a better human being. To ensure that silence was absolute, guards wore wool socks over their shoes, so their footsteps made no sound. Every time an inmate left his cell, a thick hood was placed over his head, so he could never see another human face, never map the building, never feel anything other than completely cosmically alone. Charles Dickens visited in 1842. He was not a man easily disturbed. He had spent his career documenting child labor, debtors' prisons, and the worst machinery of industrial poverty. He walked through these cell blocks, looked into these cells, and wrote that the psychological suffering inflicted on the men inside was immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. Decades later, Al Capone spent 7 months inside these walls. Legend holds that his nights were not peaceful, that he could be heard some nights calling out into the dark, begging, by some accounts, for someone who wasn't there to leave him alone. This is the story of Eastern State Penitentiary, a place built on a beautiful idea by people who genuinely believed in it, and what happened when that idea met the human mind, one solitary cell at a time. Chapter 1. The World That Built the Prison. Before there was Eastern State Penitentiary, there was the Walnut Street Jail. If you wanted to understand why a group of Philadelphia idealists decided to build the most ambitious prison in human history, you only needed to spend an hour inside that building. Every category of offender, murderers, pickpockets, debtors, the mentally ill, men awaiting trial for crimes they may not have committed, thrown together into communal rooms with no supervision, no structure, and no pretense of rehabilitation. Corruption moved freely through the cells. Violence was ordinary. Those who entered as minor offenders often emerged as something worse, having spent their sentence being educated in crime by the men around them. One reformer of the era called it a moral pest house, a place that did not contain criminality so much as cultivate it. This was American justice in the years just after the Revolution, a young nation that had just declared to the world that all men possessed inherent dignity was housing its prisoners in conditions that assumed the opposite. Philadelphia noticed. And in 1787, a physician named Benjamin Rush decided to do something about it. Rush was not a quiet man. He had signed the Declaration of Independence. He had served as Surgeon General of the Continental Army. He believed, with the full force of Enlightenment conviction, that human beings were shaped by their environments, and that if you change the environment, you could change the person. Crime, in his view, was not a permanent moral condition. It was a symptom, and symptoms could be treated. He founded the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, long enough to see the movement he had helped launch gain serious institutional momentum. The society attracted lawyers, physicians, clergy, and civic leaders. They were serious people with serious ambitions. They believed, without irony, that they could engineer a better human being. The philosophical engine behind their thinking was Enlightenment optimism in its purest form. If environment shapes behavior, then a reformed environment produces reformed behavior. Remove a man from the corrupting influence of other criminals. Give him silence, labor, and time alone with his conscience, and he will, by the natural operation of a healthy mind, freed from external corruption, become penitent. That word, penitent, is the key to everything. The reformers did not want a prison. They wanted a penitentiary, a place not for punishment, but for the making of penitence, a place where a man would not be broken, but rebuilt. Now, it is often said that Eastern State Penitentiary was a Quaker institution. The truth is more complicated. The society drew heavily on Quaker ideas, the belief in the inner light of every human being, the value of silence and inward reflection, the conviction that even the worst offender carried within him the capacity for redemption. But the society itself was less than half Quaker in its membership, and it was led for nearly 50 years by Philadelphia's Anglican bishop, William White. This was not a Quaker prison. It was an Enlightenment experiment with Quaker spiritual DNA. And that distinction matters because the ambition behind Eastern State was not merely religious, it was scientific. These men believed they had found the formula. It took decades of lobbying before the Pennsylvania legislature agreed. But in 1821, funding was finally approved for a new institution. Purpose-built, unprecedented in scale, designed from the ground up to embody the theory in every brick and corridor. 4 architects submitted designs. The commission went to John Haviland, a British-born architect who had settled in Philadelphia and who understood, better than anyone else who submitted a proposal, what the building needed to accomplish on 2 entirely different levels simultaneously. The exterior was designed to communicate one thing to the outside world: dread. A man considering a life of crime would look at those walls and think twice, but step through the gate, and Haviland's interior revealed something unexpected. Vaulted ceilings, barrel arches, long corridors with the proportions of a cathedral nave, a building that, on the inside, was meant to feel like a church. The architecture itself was the argument. Outside, the consequence of sin. Inside, the possibility of grace. Haviland's rival, William Strickland, was initially appointed to oversee construction. He was fired within the year. Haviland took full control. Construction began in 1822 on a 10-acre plot of elevated farmland just outside Philadelphia, far enough from the city that the prisoners would be removed from every familiar influence, close enough that the building would remain visible on the horizon as a permanent reminder of what awaited those who broke the law. And the world was already paying attention. In 1826, 3 years before the prison received its first inmate, the Marquis de Lafayette, hero of 2 revolutions, the most celebrated living symbol of the alliance between American idealism and European Enlightenment thought, made a point of visiting the unfinished site. He walked through the half-built corridors, examined the plans, and departed satisfied. The building was not yet finished. Not a single prisoner had yet been led through its gates, and already governments on 3 continents were taking notes. Chapter 2: The Design of Total Silence. Stand at the center of Eastern State Penitentiary and look in any direction. 7 cell blocks radiate outward from where you stand, fanning out like the spokes of a massive wheel, each one a long stone corridor stretching toward the outer walls. From this single point, one guard could see the entrance to every corridor at once. No blind corners, no hidden passages, no place inside this building where a human being could exist without being, at least theoretically, observable. This was the radial plan, and it was a masterpiece of controlled space, the kind of architectural thinking that makes you admire the mind behind it before you fully reckon with what it was designed to do. Each of the 7 original cell blocks contained 2 rows of individual cells, each one 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep, and 10 feet high. Large enough to live in, small enough that after weeks, then months, then years, the dimensions would become as familiar as the interior of a skull. The cells were not, by the standards of 1829, uncomfortable. They were, in fact, extraordinary. Each cell had running water, a flush toilet, and had central heating. Hot water piped through curved iron along one wall, keeping the space warm through Philadelphia winters. These were not amenities the average American family or even the President of the United States enjoyed. The White House itself had neither running water nor indoor plumbing at the time Eastern State opened its doors. In the entire young republic, there was arguably no more technologically advanced domestic space than the inside of a solitary cell at Eastern State Penitentiary, the most advanced living quarters in America. And inside those same 4 walls, every other human comfort was being systematically removed. Above each cell, set into the vaulted ceiling, was a single circular skylight. The designers called it the Eye of God. It emitted one shaft of light, diffuse, unpredictable, shifting with the seasons and the hours, that fell onto the stone floor of the cell below. It was meant to be a reminder. You are seen, it said, not by the guard in the corridor, not by the warden making his rounds, by something larger, something inescapable. The architects had built divine surveillance into the ceiling. The cell door was low, deliberately so. A man entering his cell had to bend at the waist, had to bow his head, had to fold himself through the frame every single time, whether he had been there a day or a decade. The act of entering your own cell was, by architectural design, an act of submission. Penance built so deeply into the structure that it required no enforcement. The building enforced it for you. Once inside, the inmate would receive his meals through a small aperture set into the door, a slot just large enough to pass a bowl and a piece of bread. The guard on the other side did not speak, did not make eye contact, did not acknowledge the human being on the other side of the wood and iron any more than was strictly necessary to complete the transfer. The feeding aperture was not just a convenience, it was a philosophical statement. You are fed and alive, but you are alone. When an inmate needed to leave his cell, a guard would appear and place a thick cloth hood over the inmate's head before he took a single step into the corridor. The hood had no eye holes in the early decades of the prison's operation. The inmate walked blind, led by a hand on his arm, through corridors he could not map, past other men he could not see, to destinations he could not anticipate. He would never know the layout of the building he lived in. He would never be able to picture it. The physical world beyond his four walls was to remain, for the duration of his sentence, an abstraction. The guards, for their part, were required to conduct their rounds in near total silence. The idea was that an inmate should not be able to tell from inside his cell whether a guard was 5 feet away or 50, whether he was being watched at this particular moment or not. The uncertainty was the point. The silence was not simply an absence of noise. It was an active, engineered presence, a weight that pressed on every waking hour. Even the exercise yards were designed to deny human contact. Each cell had a small individual yard attached to its rear wall, enclosed by high stone partitions so that a man exercising could not see into the yards on either side. The timing of exercise periods was carefully coordinated so that no two adjacent prisoners would ever be outside simultaneously. Solitude was not left to chance. It was scheduled. Haviland even attempted to engineer silence into the plumbing. He designed a dedicated pipe system for each cell specifically to prevent inmates from tapping messages to one another through shared walls or drain lines. He hoped to seal even that narrow channel of human communication. The prisoners found workarounds almost immediately, which should have been the first sign. Human beings, it turns out, are remarkably difficult to fully isolate from one another. They will tap on walls. They will whisper through gaps in stone. They will find each other across any distance the architecture imposes, through sheer biological need. The designers of Eastern State had not accounted for that need, or rather, they had. And they had decided it was the problem to be solved, not the reality to be respected. The theory, stated plainly, went like this. Silence forces the mind inward. Inward reflection produces guilt. Guilt produces penitence. Penitence produces a reformed citizen, ready to re-enter society as a productive and morally renewed human being. It was a beautiful theory, logical, humane in its intentions, grounded in the most progressive thinking of its age. It was also a theory that had never been tested on an actual human mind for an actual extended period of time. A system so total, so absolute, so perfectly engineered, that it left no room for the human mind to survive what was being asked of it. Chapter 3. Opening Day and the First Cracks. In October of 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary received its first inmate. His name was Charles Williams. The prison's admissions ledger recorded him with the bureaucratic precision that the institution would apply to every human being who passed through its gates. Prisoner number 1, burglar, light black skin, 5 feet 7 inches tall, foot 11 inches, scar on nose, scar on thigh, broad mouth, black eyes, farmer by trade, can read. Theft included one $20 watch, one $3 gold seal, one gold key. Sentenced to 2 years confinement with labor. A man reduced to measurements and stolen goods before he ever reached his cell. A human being cataloged like inventory and filed away into the silence. Williams was led through the entrance gate with a hood over his head, guided down a corridor he could not see, and placed inside a cell he would inhabit for the next 2 years. The door closed behind him. The feeding aperture shut. For a brief moment, Eastern State operated more or less as its designers had intended. The warden, Samuel Wood, made his required daily rounds. The overseers saw each inmate 3 times a day. The silence held, at least officially. The system that reformers had lobbied for, across 3 decades of persistence, was finally, at last, in motion. And then reality arrived, as it tends to do, without asking permission. By the time the 3rd cell block was completed and operational, the prison was already over capacity. The perfect system, designed for 250 inmates in strict individual confinement, was being pressed beyond its limits before the mortar on its newest walls had fully dried. New cell blocks were ordered. 2-story structures began rising in the spaces between the original single-story wings, each additional floor adding bodies and subtracting incrementally from the integrity of the isolation the entire system depended upon. The ideal was already being quietly renegotiated with arithmetic. Then came the escapes. In 1832, 3 years after the prison opened, an inmate made the first successful escape from Eastern State Penitentiary. This was not some desperate, hardened criminal who had spent months planning a sophisticated breakout. He was an inmate who served in the warden's household, someone who, by virtue of his domestic role, enjoyed freedoms and access that the Pennsylvania system's rules explicitly forbade. He simply climbed to the roof of the front building and lowered himself down the outside wall. He was caught and returned. In 1837, he escaped again, by the exact same method. The system that was supposed to make the very idea of escape psychologically unthinkable could not contain a man whose primary qualification for freedom was access to a rope and a familiarity with the building's roofline. The warden's own household had defeated the Pennsylvania system twice before the prison's first decade was complete. By 1834, the problems had grown serious enough to warrant a formal investigation. State legislators examined the prison's finances, its punishment practices, and what the official report delicately called deviations from the Pennsylvania system. Guards had been found fraternizing with inmates. Visitors had been allowed contact that the rules prohibited. The gap between what Eastern State's administrators reported to the outside world and what was actually occurring inside its walls was already measurable, already wide enough that investigators felt compelled to put it in writing. None of this was visible to the outside world. What the outside world saw was something else entirely. In 1831, 2 French civil servants arrived in Philadelphia on a formal mission to study the American penitentiary system on behalf of the French government. Their names were Gustave de Beaumont and Alexis de Tocqueville, the latter of whom would later write Democracy in America, one of the most penetrating analyses of the young republic ever produced. They toured Eastern State with the careful attention of men who understood that what they were looking at might reshape European criminal justice for generations. Their admiration was genuine. The radial plan, the individual cells, the principle of separation. They found much to commend. They returned to France and reported that the Pennsylvania system represented a meaningful advance over the communal squalor of European prisons. But their report contained a reservation that cut to the heart of the entire enterprise. They noted that all an inmate actually needed to do in order to survive and eventually leave Eastern State Penitentiary was to behave as though the silence had worked, to wear the outward appearance of a reformed man without any corresponding internal transformation. The system had no mechanism for distinguishing genuine reformation from skilled imitation. Eastern State, they suggested, might not be producing penitent men at all. It might be producing very convincing actors. The competing model was the Auburn system, developed in New York. Prisoners forced to work together in enforced silence during the day, confined separately at night. It was cheaper, easier to administer, and favored by most American states. Auburn won the domestic argument. Eastern State lost it. And yet, the rest of the world chose differently. Over 300 prisons across South America, Europe, Russia, China, Japan, and the British Empire would eventually be built on Haviland's radial plan. The idea that America was largely rejecting at home was being exported and copied across the globe. Eastern State was winning the world, and quietly, behind its 30-foot stone walls, it was already beginning to lose itself. By the time the prison's first decade had closed, the gap between what Eastern State was supposed to be and what it actually was had already opened. Not dramatically, not with any single catastrophic failure, just steadily, incrementally, the way all great idealistic systems tend to come apart, one small compromise at a time, each one nudging the institution a little further from the idea that had conjured it into existence. The building was magnificent. The theory was coherent. The human beings inside both were already telling a different story. Chapter 4: Charles Dickens and the Verdict of the World. In 1842, Charles Dickens came to America. He was 30 years old, and he arrived with a list of things he intended to see before he left. At the top of that list were two destinations. The first was Niagara Falls. The second was Eastern State Penitentiary. Hold that pairing for a moment. One of the natural wonders of the world, and a prison in Philadelphia. That is what Eastern State had become in the imagination of the educated classes. Not just a building, not just a penal institution, but a phenomenon. An idea made of stone that demanded to be witnessed firsthand. Dickens was not a soft man, and he was not a sentimental one. A man whose moral authority on matters of human suffering was essentially uncontested. He had spent his career excavating the machinery of Victorian poverty, the workhouses, the debtors' prisons, the factories where children worked 14-hour days in the dark. He arrived at Eastern State with open eyes and, by his own account, genuine curiosity about whether the Pennsylvania system was as humane as its advocates claimed. He spent an entire day inside the building. He was thorough, he was fair, and he tried to approach what he was seeing with the assumption that the men who had designed and operated this institution had done so in good faith. He left convinced that they had, and that it made no difference whatsoever. What Dickens published in American Notes was not a description of his own discomfort. It was not a record of personal horror. It was something more precise and more devastating than that. It was an observation about what the system was doing to the men inside it, written by someone who had looked at those men's faces long enough to read what was written there. He wrote that he held the slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. The key word is tampering, not breaking, not destroying in any sudden or visible way. Tampering, gradual, incremental, invisible from the outside, accumulating across months and years until whatever had been a self was simply no longer there. He was not describing a dramatic collapse. He was describing something quieter and more thorough than that. And he was describing it not as something that might happen, but as something he had observed in the faces of specific men on a specific afternoon in Philadelphia. When American Notes was published later that year, the response was immediate and international. Here was a man whose moral authority on matters of human suffering was essentially uncontested in the English-speaking world, stating plainly that the Pennsylvania system was cruel and wrong, not in its intentions, which he acknowledged were humane, but in its effects, which he had observed with his own eyes on an afternoon in Philadelphia. It was the first crack in the public foundation of Eastern State's reputation that could not be plastered over or officially disputed. And here is the irony that the prison's history cannot escape. At precisely the moment Dickens' verdict was beginning to circulate, being read in drawing rooms in London, debated in reform circles in Paris, reprinted and discussed across the Western world, Eastern State Penitentiary was, by every external measure, at the height of its glory. The original construction had been completed in 1836, 11 acres, more than 400 centrally heated, individually plumbed, sky-lit cells. The most expensive public building in the history of the United States at the time of its completion, nearly $800,000, a sum that had made Pennsylvania legislators wince even as they approved it. The building had cost more than the United States Capitol. It had amenities that outstripped the White House. And in 1858 alone, nearly 2 decades after Dickens had walked its corridors and come away shaken, more than 10,000 tourists visited Eastern State Penitentiary. They came from Philadelphia and from Europe. They came with notebooks and with curiosity, and with the particular frisson of encountering something that was at once idealistic and deeply unsettling. They stood at the center of the radial plan and looked down those 7 silent corridors and felt something they could not entirely name. The world was horrified and fascinated in equal measure. It always had been. It could not look away. What it was not doing was listening to what the building was quietly, methodically, producing inside its cells. The tourists saw the architecture. They did not stay long enough to see what the architecture did to the men who could not leave. Chapter 5. The Machinery of Suffering. There is a version of Eastern State Penitentiary that exists in the official record, in the annual reports filed with the Pennsylvania legislature, in the correspondence of the prison board, in the carefully worded statements of wardens who understood that their institution was under constant international scrutiny. In that version, Eastern State was a place of orderly silence and purposeful reformation. Inmates worked, they reflected, they moved slowly and in hoods toward penitence and eventual release as better men than they had entered. And then there is the other version, the one documented in investigations, in recorded deaths, in the testimonies of people who were inside the building when the official record was not looking. The reformers who designed the Pennsylvania system never sanctioned what happened in the cell blocks after dark, or in the punishment rooms, or in the pit beneath cell block 14. That much is true, and it matters. These methods were never part of the official rules. They were what happened in the space between the rules and the reality, in the silence the institution demanded of everyone inside it. But it is equally true that the system the reformers designed, absolute isolation, total silence, the removal of every ordinary human anchor, created the precise conditions in which cruelty could flourish unobserved and unreported for years at a time. They did not build a torture chamber. They built something that made one possible. The difference is important. It is not, in the end, a consolation. The official name for what happened when an inmate broke the rules was individual treatment. The phrase deserves a moment of attention. In a prison built entirely on the premise of individual reformation, punishment was also naturally individual, tailored, personal, which meant, in practice, that it occurred in private, between a guard and a prisoner, in the silence that the institution demanded of everyone inside it. The water bath was considered, by the guards who administered it, a relatively moderate response to moderate infractions. An inmate would be taken outside into the prison yard, doused with cold water, then chained to the exterior wall and left there through the night. In winter, the water on the inmate's clothing and skin would begin to freeze as the temperature dropped through the night hours. By morning, a thin layer of ice had formed across the body. It is worth noting that the water bath was borrowed from the mental hospitals of the era, where it was used as a therapeutic intervention for patients considered dangerously agitated. The guards who applied it to prisoners were doing something recognizable, something that institutions of care and correction used on people who needed to be brought back under control. That understanding tells you something important about how the line between punishment and treatment had already blurred to the same people for the same institutional purpose. The iron gag occupied a different category entirely. An iron piece was clamped onto the tongue, chained to the wrists bound high behind the back. The arrangement was such that any movement of the arms caused the tongue to tear. The punishment was designed specifically for inmates caught attempting to communicate with other prisoners. It was the system's answer to speech. You tried to connect with another human being. This is what connection costs. In 1833, an inmate named Matthias Macumsey died while subjected to the iron gag. His death became a public scandal, one of the first moments when what was happening inside Eastern State's walls forced itself into the official record in a way that could not be smoothed over. An investigation followed, reports were filed, the institution absorbed the scandal and continued operating. The punishment continued to be used. The mad chair bound an inmate in leather restraints tight enough that it left them immobile for hours or days, with lasting damage to the limbs in severe cases. And then there was the hole. Beneath cell block 14, dug into the earth below the prison's already subterranean foundation, was an underground cell. No light reached it from any source. The inmate placed inside received minimal food and water, and no human contact for however long the punishment lasted, up to 2 weeks in documented cases. There were no dramatic architectural features, just a pit in the ground with a door on it, just darkness and silence and the walls of the earth pressing in from every side. It would be a mistake to describe these punishments only in terms of their physical effects. The men subjected to them were already living inside a system that had stripped away every ordinary human anchor, every voice, every face, every unprompted sound that tells a person they are part of a world that contains other people. They added suffering to an existing condition of profound deprivation. Now, consider for a moment the guards. They were young men charged with enforcing total silence, trained to move through the building as though they were not there, to pass meals through apertures without speaking, to observe men through peepholes without being seen, hour after hour, year after year, in a system of erasure in which their own presence was supposed to register as nothing. What that kind of work does to a person over time is not something the annual reports recorded, but it is not difficult to imagine. A system that trains its employees to treat human beings as problems to be managed through silence and invisibility does not produce men who are well equipped to recognize the humanity of the people in their care. And so, the physicians' reports accumulated. Year after year, the prison's own medical staff documented rising rates of what the era called insanity among the inmate population. Men who had arrived disturbed were deteriorating. Men who had arrived apparently stable were developing symptoms that had no name in the medical vocabulary of the time. The reports noted the cases. They attributed the causes to heredity, to moral weakness, to the particular susceptibility of certain constitutions, to almost everything the language of 19th century medicine made available to them. Everything except the obvious. The thing that Charles Dickens had said in plain English after a single afternoon inside the building, and that the prison's own physicians were documenting case by case across decades of accumulated evidence, that the silence was not healing these men, that the silence was what was destroying them. Chapter 6. Capone and the Prison's Famous Sinners. By 1913, the Pennsylvania system was officially dead. It had been dying for decades, killed not by any single dramatic failure, but by the same slow arithmetic that had been undermining the institution since its first years of operation. Too many bodies, too few cells, too little space to maintain the absolute separation that the entire theory depended upon. The official abandonment of solitary confinement in 1913 was less a decision than an acknowledgement, a formal recognition of something that had already been true on the ground for a generation. Eastern State would now operate as a congregate prison, its inmates eating together, working together, moving through the building in groups rather than in hoods. The Gothic architecture remained unchanged. The vaulted corridors, the radial plan, the 30-foot outer walls, the eye of God looking down from each cell's ceiling. All of it still there, exactly as Haviland had designed it nearly a century before. The building had outlasted its own philosophy, and whatever had accumulated inside those walls across 80 years of silence and suffering remained too. Into this building, transferred in August of 1929, came Alphonse Capone. He had not come voluntarily. Capone had been arrested in Philadelphia on May 17, 1929. Less than 4 months after the St. Valentine's Day massacre had made him the most wanted man in America, on the charge of carrying a concealed weapon. He was sentenced to 1 year. He spent the first months in the county jail before being transferred to Eastern State, where he would serve 7 months of his sentence. Philadelphia newspapers reported on the condition of Capone's cell, though Eastern State's own records later disputed whether he received any special treatment beyond what any inmate could arrange for himself from the prison store. According to those newspaper accounts, the floor was covered with oriental rugs, oil paintings hung on the walls, a polished wooden desk sat in one corner, and a cabinet radio filled the cell with music. The whole room, one reporter wrote, was suffused in the warm glow of a desk lamp. Whether or not Capone's cell was truly exceptional, what is not disputed is that the building itself, legend holds, gave him no peace. The stories that circulated among guards and inmates during his 7 months at Eastern State were never officially documented, never verified, and should be understood as exactly what they are: stories. But they persisted with a consistency that is, at minimum, atmospherically interesting. Capone's nights, according to those stories, were not the nights of a man at ease. He could be heard in the dark hours, his voice carrying through the vaulted corridors, calling out, by some accounts begging, for someone named Jimmy to leave him alone. James Clark had been one of the 7 men killed on February 14, 1929, in a Chicago garage on Capone's orders. He was a low-ranking member of the Bugs Moran organization, Moran's own brother-in-law, and he died against a wall with the others in what the newspapers called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Whatever haunted Capone's nights at Eastern State, no one can say with any certainty. What is certain is that the stories followed him out. Through his subsequent imprisonment in Atlanta, through his years at Alcatraz, where similar disturbances in the night were reported. Whatever it was, it did not stay behind in Philadelphia when his sentence ended. Capone was the most famous person Eastern State ever held, but he was not the most determined to leave it. That distinction belongs, perhaps, to the 12 men who on April 3, 1945, crawled one by one through a tunnel that had taken the better part of a year to build. 97 feet of hand-dug passage running beneath the prison's outer wall and emerging onto Fairmount Avenue in the early morning darkness. The tunnel had been designed and built largely by a prison plasterer named Clarence Kleindienst. It was equipped, in its later stages, with electric lights and a ventilation system, engineering that required both ingenuity and a remarkable degree of organizational discipline to carry out undetected inside an active prison. Clarence Kleindienst had 2 years remaining on his sentence when he crawled through that tunnel into the April morning. 2 years. He had made the calculation, somewhere in the logic of a mind shaped by years of confinement, that 2 years was not waitable, that the tunnel was the more reasonable option. He was recaptured within hours. He received 10 additional years. One of his accomplices was caught in Honolulu, Hawaii, having traveled further from Eastern State's walls than any other escapee in the prison's history, before the net finally closed around him. Most of the others were caught within minutes of emerging from the tunnel, blinking in the early light of Fairmount Avenue, apparently unsure what to do with freedom now that they had reached it. There was one exception. In 1923, a man named Leo Callahan scaled the east wall with 5 armed accomplices, walked out into the city of Philadelphia, and was never seen again. The only person in 142 years of Eastern State's operation to escape its walls and remain, to this day, unaccounted for, somewhere out beyond the reach of the historical record. Chapter 7. The System That Devoured Itself. To understand how completely the original vision had collapsed, you only need to follow the architecture. The building was expensive precisely because every one of those elements was considered philosophically essential. Not a comfort, but a component of the system. By 1877, the prison had run out of room between its existing cell blocks, and 4 new ones were constructed in the remaining spaces. These new cell blocks had none of the original features. No exercise yards, the new blocks were wedged too tightly between existing structures to admit light from above. No arched ceilings, just floors and walls and cells stacked on top of cells, as many as the footprint could hold. Haviland's philosophical architecture was being literally bricked over by its own failure, new concrete pressing against old stone, the ideal entombed inside the institution it had created. By 1911, Cell Block 12 had been completed, built of reinforced concrete, 3 floors of 40 cells each, narrow windows in place of skylights, no concession whatsoever to the original vision. It looked like what it was, a cage built because there were too many men and not enough room, and the theory had long since stopped mattering to anyone responsible for managing the daily reality. And beneath all of it, invisible until workers broke ground during renovations in the 1930s, was perhaps the most eloquent testimony to what life inside Eastern State had actually been. Approximately 30 incomplete tunnels were discovered dug into the earth beneath the prison. 30 separate attempts by men who could not coordinate through any legitimate channel, men who had nevertheless found ways to spend years moving dirt in the dark toward an outer wall they might never reach. 30 tunnels that went nowhere. The Pennsylvania system had promised that silence would produce penitence. What it had actually produced was this: a biological refusal to stop trying to get out. There was one man, in the years before the system's final collapse, who tried to hold the institution's founding idealism together through sheer force of personal conviction. Robert McKenty served as warden from 1908 to 1923, known to the Philadelphia press as the Preacher Warden, a former police detective who believed that job training, education, and what he called practical Christianity, offered a more durable path out of criminality than punishment alone. He made friends with his prisoners. He tried to connect Eastern State's original reformist purpose to something resembling practice. He largely failed, but he was the last thread connecting the building that stood in 1923 to the idea that had conjured it into existence in 1787. McKenty's tenure ended in 1923. The riots came in 1933 and 1934. Inmates set fires in their cells and destroyed the workshops. They short-circuited electrical systems and caused disturbances that required outside intervention to contain. By 1926, the prison designed for 250 inmates had been holding 1,700. By the time of the riots, the situation had not improved. In 1961, the cell blocks were formally desegregated, a reminder that the institution had been operating for the entirety of its history until that point, under the racial divisions that structured every American institution of its era, and that the Pennsylvania system's promise of individual reformation had always been applied within those divisions rather than in spite of them. In 1965, the federal government designated Eastern State Penitentiary a National Historic Landmark. The prison was still operational. Men were still being held inside it. In January of 1971, Eastern State Penitentiary closed. The walls were in near-perfect condition. The original stonework, the vaulted ceilings of the early cell blocks, the Gothic entrance facade, all of it essentially intact, as solid as the day Haviland's crews had laid the last stone. The paint was clean. The outer perimeter was unbreached. The electrical systems had collapsed entirely. The mechanical infrastructure was in ruins. The building that had been designed to last forever had outlasted its own ability to function. The stone endured. Everything inside it had given out. Chapter 8. An urban forest inside a prison. When the last prisoner left Eastern State Penitentiary in January of 1971, the building did not go quietly into disuse. It simply stopped. The Philadelphia Streets Department moved in, not to preserve the building, but to use the grounds as a storage yard. Equipment was parked in the exercise yards where inmates had once walked their solitary hourly circuits. The city treated the space the way cities treat spaces that have become inconvenient to think about, as somewhere to put things that had nowhere else to go. Vandals came too. The skylights were smashed open to the weather. Rain moved through the cell blocks freely. Frost crept into the stone each winter and worked at the mortar the way time works at everything, without urgency, without mercy. And then the forest came. Within a few years of the prison's closure, vegetation had begun its reclamation. Trees pushed upward through the concrete floors of cells designed for silent human reflection, rooting in the rubble, finding purchase in the cracks, growing toward the broken skylights and the open sky above. Vines moved along the vaulted corridors, pulling at the stone, softening the right angles, returning the architecture to something older and less certain than Haviland had intended. The cell blocks that had been engineered to contain and control every living thing within their walls were being quietly, methodically reclaimed by the indifferent industry of plants. In 1974, Mayor Frank Rizzo proposed solving the problem of Eastern State Penitentiary by demolishing it entirely and building a criminal justice center on the site. Replace the ruin of one failed system of justice with a functioning monument to the next one. The proposal was ultimately unsuccessful. The building survived. Through the late 1970s and into the 80s, proposals for commercial redevelopment circulated through city government. A shopping mall was considered. A luxury apartment complex was seriously discussed. The institution that had once been the most copied prison design in the world came within bureaucratic reach of becoming retail space. In 1988, a coalition of architects, preservationists, and historians formed the Eastern State Penitentiary Task Force and petitioned Mayor Wilson Goode to halt the redevelopment process. He did. Stabilization work began in earnest in 1991, not restoration. It would be preserved as what it had become, a ruin. The decay would be stabilized, held at its current state, prevented from progressing further. But the peeling paint, the crumbling plaster, the vines, the broken light, all of it would remain. The building would be allowed to tell the truth about what time and abandonment looked like. In 1994, Eastern State Penitentiary opened for daily historic tours. In its first year, more than 10,000 people came. The place that had once held 1,700 men against their will now drew crowds of people who arrived voluntarily, paid for the privilege, and stood in the silence of the vaulted corridors by choice. The building that had been engineered to erase human connection was now drawing visitors from around the world who came, willingly, to feel what remained of it. There is something in that inversion that Eastern States founders could not have predicted and would not, perhaps, have known what to make of. The building had outlasted its purpose, its philosophy, its operational life, and two serious proposals for its demolition. It was still standing. It was still, in its ruined way, speaking. Chapter 9: What the Silence Taught Us. Every generation that has looked at Eastern State Penitentiary has seen something different in it. The reformers of 1829 saw the future, a humane and rational answer to the brutality of everything that had come before. The tourists of 1858 saw a marvel, something between a cathedral and a curiosity worth traveling miles to witness. Charles Dickens saw a warning. The prisoners who dug 30 tunnels toward walls they would never breach saw the only door that remained available to them. The preservationists who saved it from the wrecking ball saw responsibility. What each of them saw was real. None of them saw all of it. What the building asks of us now, standing in its crumbling corridors, looking up through a broken skylight, is something more uncomfortable than admiration or horror. It asks us to sit with the fact that the people who built this place were not monsters. They were idealists, educated, humane, genuinely motivated by the belief that human beings are capable of redemption and that institutions could be designed to facilitate it. They were the good people in the room, but they built a machine that destroyed minds. They were not cruel men, they were wrong men. The distance between those two things is the entire tragedy of Eastern State Penitentiary. The building still stands. 11 acres of crumbling stone and vaulted corridors in Philadelphia, preserved in its decay, maintained as a ruin that is allowed to tell the truth. It is not a monument to failure. It is evidence that even the most idealistic systems become instruments of suffering the moment they lose sight of the individual human being inside them. There is one fact worth carrying out of these walls. The United States today incarcerates more people per capita than any other nation on earth. The questions that Benjamin Rush and his colleagues gathered to answer in 1787, what is justice for? What does rehabilitation require? What do we owe the people we have decided to punish? Those questions are not answered. They are not even close to answered. Eastern State Penitentiary was not a detour in the history of American criminal justice. It was an early chapter in a story that is still being written. Eastern State Penitentiary was built by people who believed in human goodness so deeply that they created a system which proved human goodness cannot survive without human connection. It stands today not as a warning about cruelty, but as a warning about certainty, about what happens when an idea is so perfect, so complete, so thoroughly right, that there is no longer any room inside it for a human being. The silence in the end was never the cure. It was always the disease.